thank you very much, and good Friday morning to everyone. Thank you for joining us wherever you're joining us from the West Coast where I am, or Toronto, or the East Coast, or somewhere around the world. I know we've got a very good international group in this course, and I always look forward to our Friday morning. So we got 2 sessions left. Next week, we're going to talk about how we kind of improve the economy and try to make it work better for people and communities and the environment. Today, we're going to talk about the COVID pandemic and what it did to the economy, and we'll use it as a bit of a case study in a bigger issue, which is, why is the economy subject to these boom and bust cycles, the kind of roller coaster pattern? So we will talk about the specifics of the pandemic and its economic impacts, but also think about it as a pedagogical opportunity, if I can use a highfalutin word, to think about the instability in the economy more broadly and what we do about it. So, of course, the pandemic has been just an unbelievable, in many ways, catastrophic and frightening event. And on the other hand, it's been a cause for communities to pull together, a cause for our governments to do incredible things to protect Canadians and help us through the pandemic, and a cause for us all to think about how we organize the economy, how we value work, how we take care of each other, and lots of lessons. Of course, the pandemic is not over. We're almost 2 years into it, and we know it's still evolving and still a moving target. In fact, this worrisome news about possible new variants evolving in countries where vaccination hasn't been widespread or available, and therefore the virus continues to mutate. We've had, of course, all the names for the viruses in Greek letters: Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Delta, of course, is the one we've been dealing with. I don't know what the new one is. Oops, there goes one now. I don't know if they'll call that a epsilon virus, carry on with that A, B, C, D, E Greek letter one. Or who knows what other mutations might occur as the virus continues to unfold. This one, I think this one is going to be called the Kappa Lambda Eta version of the virus. It's named after a fraternity, because this one looks like a worm, and we all know that fraternities never vacuum at home, so they've got tons of worms around there. This is one that could be particularly damaging. This is called the My Little Kitty version of the virus floating by me there. So I better put on my mask with all these things, but you won't be able to hear me. So okay. You got to laugh or cry about these things, but this is certainly a very serious subject with some lessons, some of them challenging, but some of them hopeful. So let's cut to the chase here and start our lecture, Economics for Everyone. Before we get to the case on COVID and the post-COVID economy, I want to just have a word back. You remember last week, we talked about how every time we have a class, we talk about something, and then, all hell breaks loose the next week about whatever it was we were talking about. We did that in terms of labor markets and minimum wage policy. That happened with climate change, and then we had the floods in BC. Last week, we talked about Bitcoin. So guess what happened? After we talked about Bitcoin, the price of Bitcoin crashed. Last week, particularly Thursday, was a very bad day for Bitcoin. It lost about 4% in one day. And over the last 2 weeks, Bitcoin has lost 18% of its value. So this shows the price of Bitcoin over the month of November. And it peaked in the second week of November, $84,000 US for one non-fungible crypto token. Okay, it actually has no embodiment. It has no material content. It's purely computer code. And the only reason it has value is because other people think it has value. And unlike tulip bulbs or property or Banksy, art by Banksy. Remember last week, I couldn't remember the guy's name, that artist who does the graffiti in Britain, Banksy. That was a Banksy painting I had. Or gold even. All of those things have some inherent value. Bitcoin has no inherent value. It is purely a construct of computer programmers who think I've programmed something that no one else can match. That gives it secrecy. It can't be replicated. And, well, why don't we use it for money? So it depends. As long as other people think it could have value, then it will, except there's no government behind it. There's no central bank to stabilize it, and there's no real world use for it. You can't actually buy stuff with Bitcoin. Remember, we mentioned Elon Musk at one point said you could buy Teslas with Bitcoin, and this was considered a big breakthrough, and the price of Bitcoin shot up. This is why Elon Musk changed his mind. Okay, you see on November 8th, the Bitcoin was worth 84,000. Today, it's worth 69,000. It has lost 18% of its value. And Elon Musk pays his bills not in Bitcoin. He pays his bills with actual money. So if you bought if your car was the Tesla was priced in Bitcoin and you bought it on November 8th, he's getting 18% more. If you buy it today, he's getting 18% less, just because the price of Bitcoin shot up and down. And this is one of the reasons why it doesn't meet the standards of a true money, and that it doesn't. First of all, you can't buy stuff with it. Secondly, it doesn't hold its value. It all depends on what mood swings happen today. So Elon Musk quickly changed his mind about being able to buy Teslas with Bitcoin. Anyways, that's just a quick update from last week. This week, now I'm scared. This week, we're talking about the pandemic and the economy after COVID. And now I'm worried what is going to happen on the pandemic in the next week. Hopefully, it's vaccinations work and people take the vaccinations and hospitals empty out a bit. Let's hope that that's what the news is this coming week. So anyways, we're going to talk about the impact of the pandemic on the economy, and we're going to link it to the other kind of broader issues about the roller coaster pattern of our economy, recessions, why they happen, how to stop. And then we'll drill down into discussing the economic consequences of COVID in particular. I have a particular interest in work and labor markets, of course, so we'll think about that. But some of the other issues, including the impact on governments and budgets, how will the economy recover? And my vision, which is that we should take this opportunity, or take this moment, if you like, with the pandemic, to think about how we build something better in our economy through something like a national reconstruction plan. Lots of the specific terms that are defined in that online glossary that comes with Economics for Everyone, the textbook. And these are terms that relate more generally to the ups and downs of the economy and the different policy responses to that instability. So I will also note that on the website at centerforfuturework.ca, in that little section that we've got for this course, for this later life learning course, we have posted 3 additional readings because, of course, we don't talk about COVID in the textbook. It was written 5 years ago. So I have put up some additional readings for anyone who's interested, reports from our center, and also articles that I've written in different Canadian publications about the economic impacts of COVID and how to respond. So the links to those articles are on that website, where we post all of our handouts and additional materials and the glossary. Okay, so there is a clear pattern in the history of our economy, in the history of a capitalist economy, one where, as you remember, our defining features, most of the work that's done in the economy is undertaken by private firms doing it in order to make a profit. And most of the work that is done in the economy, in the monetary side of the economy, is in the form of employment or wage labor, where people are doing the work for someone else under their direction in return for some kind of compensation. And one of the features of that type of an economy that's driven by the individual decisions of separate firms to make an investment, organize production, undertake production, hire workers, buy the raw materials, sell the product, and then hope to pay the bills and have a profit left over. One of the inherent features of that type of economy is a definite cyclical pattern, boom and bust. And those cyclical patterns can occur in a short period of time, every 3, 4, 5, 6 years, what's often called the business cycle. But you also see longer term waves in the pattern of the economy as the whole economy stays relatively vibrant for long periods of time, and then experiences trouble for long periods of time. So we had a long upswing in the post-war era, the 50s, 60s, and 70s. We've had insecurity and instability in most of the period since then. We had a Great Depression in the 1930s, where we had 10 years of very high unemployment. So both short-term cycles and longer-term waves seem to be an inherent part of the economy. Why is that? What are the things that impart the ups and downs, this unstable momentum to a capitalist economy. Lots of different ways that this pattern of instability can be experienced in the economy. Lots of different reasons why it is unstable and why you can't sort of predict from one year to the next what is going to happen. So some of them are listed here. One of them is instability in the amount of investment that goes on in the economy. So our economy is led by those private profit-seeking companies. They have to make an investment in expanding a facility or starting a new workplace, hiring people, etc. So that initial decision by firms to invest is very important in how the economy functions. And investors, the owners of these companies, have got mood swings about whether they think it's a good time to invest or not. And the irony is, as they undertake those decisions, if those mood swings become contagious, if you like, if I can use that word, in the middle of a pandemic, if many investors have a similar feeling, then that can cause the economy to rise or fall. Same thing goes for consumers. Consumer spending is a big part of the economy. It makes up over 50% of GDP. In general, consumers have to buy stuff all the time. We have to be buying food, obviously, all the time, and most of the essentials. But major purchases, like buying a new car or buying a new home, those are things that don't happen regularly. They happen at different intervals, and they can be affected by changes, again, in sort of the mass psychology of consumers. And if they all feel pessimistic about something that's happening in the future, consumers might say, okay, I'm going to put off that purchase. I'm not going to buy that home. I'm not going to buy that car. I'm going to, shepherd my money more carefully and put some money aside. Again, the irony is, if enough consumers accept that mentality, they can cause the recession that they feared. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And this is why politicians always stand up and try to encourage consumers in a moment of crisis to go out and keep shopping. And it can be absolutely galling. I remember 3 days after 9/11 and the horrifying events at the World Trade Center and elsewhere, George Bush went on TV and said, Americans, keep shopping. And it just was, he did not read the room in terms of the mood of the country, but he was trying to address this issue. If consumers just get so shocked they stop spending money, then that can create a recession, which obviously makes the whole problem worse. Supply shocks are another thing that can put the whole economy off kilter and into a downturn. If there's some kind of one or more very essential commodities or inputs that are required for different types of production, and we can't get to it for various reasons. Could be because of flood, closed all of the Trans-Canada highways or all the cross-country highways, all three of them leading to Vancouver. They're still not open on a regular basis. They're trying to do emergency repairs, but that's an example. Or a war, which could disrupt supplies of oil, for example. That has caused recessions before. Other things in the supply chain that interrupt production can be the spark. Monetary policy, this is where we talked about this last week, the Bank of Canada, the federal government's bank that sets interest rates and determines or tries to influence the pace of credit creation, the amount of new borrowing that goes on in the economy. And we learned when you borrow, you're actually creating money through the banking system. If monetary policy becomes unstable or they push interest rates up too high and people stop borrowing, then lo and behold, that can cause a recession. Even without the Bank of Canada itself doing that, the private banking system and the private financial industry is very prone to booms and busts, to bubbles and collapses. For some of the reasons that we talked about last week in terms of the credit creation, putting swaths of new money into something that isn't productive, like buying Bitcoin or speculating on stocks and bonds, or even driving up the price of real estate. And when those expansion episodes reach an end and start to contract, that can throw the whole economy into recession. Same goes for, of course, the real estate and property section. That's where the global financial crisis started in the American real estate industry, which had been inflated to unsustainable levels by rapid borrowing and a very overdeveloped home construction industry for a few years. In the mid 2000s. which eventually ended because the credit bubble that was feeding into that, driving up prices, driving up construction activity collapsed. And banks collapsed, and mortgage lenders collapsed, construction industry collapsed, and that was the start of the global financial crisis in 2008. A recession can be imported to a country through foreign trade if you're dependent on a particular export or a particular group of exports, and lo and behold, foreigners stop buying it. That can cause enough of a negative shock to your economy to cause a recession. Governments can cause recessions, and this has happened many times in history, where governments decide to cut back on their spending. For one reason or another, they might be looking to try and balance the budget no matter what the consequences, or they might have political reasons for cutting spending in certain areas. And if that's done quickly and negatively, that can cause a recession. We saw that happen in Europe after the global financial crisis. The global financial crisis happened in 2008, 2009. Lo and behold, a recession in much of Europe was caused in 2011, 2012, years later, because governments were ordered by the European Union to dramatically cut spending, especially in places like Greece, Italy, Portugal, Spain, where they had big deficits. And those cutbacks in government spending actually caused another recession. So no shortage of different particular reasons why a recession can be sparked. Okay, it's sort of reminiscent of Tolstoy, right? That said, every unhappy family is unhappy for its own particular reason. So Tolstoy would say about recessions, every recession was caused by some particular unhappy factor, and it could be any one of these things. But there's a common element. Of course, COVID, exogenous shocks, something dramatic that impacts the whole economy that's not even on that list can do the same thing as we've seen and as we'll discuss today. What they all have in common, though, is that we are operating, even in good times, in a system that is highly interdependent, where everything fits together and depends on what's happening elsewhere in the economy, but very decentralized in the sense that individual decisions that are made by particular companies and by particular consumers, those individual decisions don't have any kind of organization to them, no kind of plan to them, no kind of strategy to them. Each individual business or consumer is going to respond to the stimuli that they see, to their expectations about where the economy is going. And in particular, the decisions by businesses as to whether to invest and continue to buy real capital assets, the machinery and tools and equipment and raw materials that we've talked about, hire workers, start production. This is 85% of our GDP, depends on companies doing that. And if they change their minds about whether they want to do it, that can set off a chain reaction that, in a way, infects the broader economy and causes the downturn. And those changes in decisions, usually by businesses, get amplified or magnified because of the fact that workers have to have a job in order to earn income, in order to buy the goods and services that they need for consumption. Consumer spending is not usually the leader in that cyclical process. I mentioned that changes in consumer sentiment can certainly have an impact, but in general, there's something else that started it, and then consumers follow it. For the reason being that you have to have a job and be making income in order to spend the money in the first place. So if business is growing and hiring more people, then it's obvious that consumer spending is also going to grow, because those people are going to get new income and then they're going to spend that income. And through that process of reproduction that we talked about earlier in the class. And that dependence of consumer spending, which is over half of GDP, on the initial decisions by private companies to invest and produce and employ, that's what gives it a sort of magnified spillover ripple effect that can be felt throughout the whole economy. So how a recession gets started, here's a very simple schema of it. There's some negative event. Okay, so Tolstoy's theory of recessions here is every recession is unhappy in its own particular reason, some negative event. It could be a supply shock, it could be a collapse of a particular business, it could be the central bank overdid it with high interest rates and caused a downturn in borrowing and hence in spending. Some bad event gets people's attention and gets them worried. Businesses invest less as a result of that. They produce less as a result of it. They hire less as a result of it. They pay less wages as a result of that. So that initial shock or negative stimuli is felt through the business decisions about investment and production and translate into lower employment and lower wages. But as soon as you've got lower employment and lower wages, well, you've got less consumer spending, because that's what workers do. Workers are good at going to their job and producing the goods and services they've been hired to produce. They're also good at spending their money the second that they get it. In fact, thanks to the magic of credit cards, they spend a lot of their money before they get it. And as a result, that downturn in consumer spending magnifies the shock. You end up with lower sales in the whole range of retail and consumer industries, shopping, but also restaurants and private services and home building and so on. And then that means all of those industries get lower profits as a result, and they can stop their own investment as a result. So this is where an initial one piece of bad news, a big rock thrown into the pond of the economy, creates these ripple effects that spread out into other sectors. And because of particularly the dependence of workers' consumption spending on the level of employment, this makes the impact magnified or multiplied. What economists call the multiplier effect is where some initial change in that investment decision ends up having a magnified or multiplied impact on total employment and retail sales and GDP because of those interactions. How does a recession end once it got started? Well, eventually, investors may say the worst is over, businesses, and they may say, okay, we're going to try again with this plan to expand our business and start a new undertaking and hire new people. Eventually, consumers might stabilize and say, well, I put off buying that car for a couple of years, but I really need to get a car. And frankly, this might be a good time because prices are a bit lower because we've been in a recession. And eventually, consumers can start spending again. There may be some external stimulus that gets the ball rolling. Again, for an export-oriented economy, such as Canada, if there was a burst in demand for the exports that the product that the country produces from elsewhere in the world, that could start the positive momentum again. And then you get the same chain reactions for any of these reasons, but in reverse. Now you've got investors feeling better. They're going to invest and spend more and hire people. The people who've been hired are going to make money and spend the money. And then you get the reinforced multiplied impact on the overall momentum of the economy. It can happen by itself. It can fix itself after a few painful years. It's much better and much more effective when government actually gets involved and tries to accelerate the recovery or tries to prevent or moderate the downturn. And this is what is the rationale for what we call counter-cyclical policy. Counter-cyclical economic policy by government means we're going against that boom and bust pattern. We're countering those cycles. We're going to try and prevent the economy from sliding down the roller coaster through various measures that protect spending power, that reinforce confidence, and that keep people working, people earning, people spending. And the two main forms of counter-cyclical policy are what's called fiscal policy and what's called monetary policy. Fiscal policy, we've talked about when we talked about the role of government in the economy. That is the impact of government taxes and government spending. If you're concerned that spending is falling and you're going into a recession, then what government can do to tilt against that, try and smooth out and prevent the recession, is to increase their own spending and or to cut taxes so that people in the economy have more money to spend and will go and do that. In general, the evidence shows that increasing spending is more effective at stimulating spending than cutting taxes, just because it's more direct. You just get a more immediate and complete impact by increasing government spending rather than by cutting taxes, because if you cut taxes, depending on how you do it, consumers, if they're feeling very pessimistic, might not spend the money that is now in their bank account because taxes were cut. So Another aspect of fiscal policy that's important to keep in mind is what's known as automatic stabilizers. This is the impact of the fact that some of our taxes, like income taxes in particular, but also payroll taxes, some of our taxes automatically fall when the economy slows down because less people are working, therefore you're paying less taxes. Likewise, some of our spending automatically increases when the economy slows down, such as spending on employment insurance benefits and other income programs. So even without doing anything, without making any actual decisions, government helps to stabilize the economy a bit through those automatic stabilizer effects. But usually they have to do more than that. Usually they have to engage in what's called discretionary fiscal policy, which is make actual decisions to spend more money when the economy's going into a rough spot. And we've seen over the last 2 years with COVID an incredible discretionary fiscal policy response by our governments. Incredible. We've never seen government move this big and move this fast to stabilize the economy through mostly big increases in spending on different things, including income supports for people through the CERB, if you remember, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, and then the CRB, which came after it, the Canada Recovery Benefit, and then a whole host of other income support measures, plus subsidies that were paid to employers to keep people working, even if production was down, and then a whole host of other spending initiatives, including on the public health response. So that was an enormous and rapid response, and it really, really worked. Without it, we would have gone into something like a depression. There's no doubt about it, and I'll show you the numbers on how bad employment and output were falling in the first phases of the pandemic. The other broad category of countercyclical response is monetary policy. So this is where the government's bank, the Bank of Canada, adjusts its interest rates in order to affect the pace of credit creation. And as we learned, when you borrow, you're creating money, and that is what drives spending power. And the idea is with lower interest rates, more people will borrow, more money will be created, more spending will occur. So in general, the Bank of Canada will cut interest rates during weak periods and increase interest rates if they think the economy is too strong. The problem is, oops, there go my lights again, sorry. They're being very persnickety today. I had to really wave my arms. The problem is that the interest rates were so low to start with because the economy hadn't really recovered yet in a full way from the global financial crisis. They didn't have much room to cut, so they were pretty well at zero. And this is where the Bank of Canada then found other ways to stimulate money creation and spending, not just through lower interest rates, but through what was called quantitative easing, which we mentioned earlier, whereby the bank itself creates loans, including loans to government. Just as private banks create loans for their customers, the Bank of Canada was doing it directly, and that helped as well. But the fiscal policy response to COVID was the thing that really, really saved us, and that was extraordinary in historical. One last point on this before we get into the specific impacts of COVID and the pandemic. The government, remember, because of those automatic stabilizers, the government will automatically experience some changes in its fiscal balance. In particular, if it has a deficit or a surplus. And in general, when a recession happens, government will automatically get a deficit because of those automatic stabilizer impacts. If you started out, even if you started out with a balanced budget, when the recession hits, your revenues go down because fewer people are employed and paying sales taxes and payroll taxes, and fewer people are shopping, so they're paying less sales taxes. So your revenue goes down. Plus, your expenses, to some extent, go up because of employment insurance benefits and other income support. So automatically, you get a deficit in a downturn. Suppose you were hysterical and religious about how government must always have a balanced budget. And in fact, in some jurisdictions, they even passed so-called laws, balanced budget laws, which require the government to balance the budget. And of course, if that happens in a recession, wow. That means you've already got a recession. And now what is the government going to do in discretionary policy to offset the fact that these automatic stabilizers are creating a deficit? Well, then, in the middle of a recession, government would have to either cut its spending or raise its taxes. And that's the exact opposite of countercyclical policy. That's called pro-cyclical policy. That means you're making the boom and bust worse by following this mantra that you must balance the budget in all years, including in a recession. So this is where this kind of infatuation with balanced budgets, which we've seen in the neoliberal era, is really, really off base. It can actually make the recession, it does make the recession worse. And most, very, very few economists, even mainstream economists, would say that this makes sense. But sometimes for political reasons, you've got different governments that adopt it. Okay, so that's kind of an overview of the economics of boom and bust, why the economy is unstable, how recessions start, and how they can be fixed. Let's talk about the particular boom and bust experience that we've just lived through. We've, of course, had this incredible situation where entire parts of the economy had to be shut down. So talk about a supply shock. We had huge parts of the economy, retail, hospitality, transportation, personal services, anything really that was face-to-face, hands-on in the first stage of the pandemic when we didn't understand how COVID was transmitted and what we had to do to protect ourselves, we just shut it all down. And that immediately caused some of those chain reactions that we talked about. And a retail shop closes, they stop placing orders with the wholesaler stops placing orders with the manufacturer. So what started out as a big supply shock in an important part of the economy then spread into an economy-wide recession, a deep one, a fast one. It was made worse by some of the other chain reactions that we normally see in an economic cycle, including supply chains that were disrupted because of travel and health restrictions. And that was even before the highways got washed out in the floods. And the effect on consumer spending and business investment in the initial months. Who wanted to go shopping? First of all, you couldn't go shopping, right? Because the retail sector was shut. You could do it online. But why would you want to? Because you didn't know what was coming next, right? So people really hung on to their cash. And this is one of the reasons why the government moved so quickly with these enormous income support programs. The CERB. The CERB program cost $70 billion put out in the course of a year. Huge, but it made an incredible difference to consumer sentiment. It meant that people who weren't working, first of all, didn't have to worry about being thrown out of their homes. You could get enough money from the CERB. It also meant that consumers ended up, as soon as things reopened, consumers ended up spending more than they did before the pandemic. In a way, and I don't know if you'd call it an irony or not, perhaps an unintended consequence of the CERB and those very major income supports was personal income in Canada actually went up during the pandemic, which is not what usually happens in a recession. Usually it goes down, and it's one of the things that locks in a recession and gives it the multiplied effect. Because our income support programs were so strong, net personal income actually went up because Canadians got more from the CERB than they ended up losing, it turned out, in employment income through layoffs. That's partly because of the CERB. This is the other thing. Because the CERB money was so powerful and so fast, and people kept spending, it meant people didn't lose their jobs as much as you would have expected without the CERB. So it got a virtuous circle going rather than a vicious circle. In the first period of the pandemic, we lost 3 million jobs in Canada, 15% decline in employment in 2 months. And we've never seen anything like that. And that wasn't even the whole story for reasons that I'll explain. We just got back in September to the level of employment that we were at in February 2020. So that is actually quite extraordinary. And I wouldn't have predicted that. In fact, I didn't predict that. I predicted something much worse. And that, again, is testimony to the effectiveness of that policy response. GDP, the amount of output, fell 18% in those 2 months, and we still haven't got it back. We've got people back on the job, but we don't have output back to the full level. We're still about 1.5% below where we were at. Incomes lost for households, of course, for businesses, for other organizations in society. And that initial downturn was faster and deeper than we saw even in the 1930s. So this is where we were facing something extremely dangerous, not just in health terms, but in economic terms. The key task was to stop it from becoming a depression like the 1930s was. in the 1930s, governments didn't know how to act, and they didn't have the capacity to act as quickly as they did. In fact, they were still governed by mistaken ideas, including that the government should try to balance its budget in the middle of a depression. And so those policy errors in the 30s is what made it a decade-long recession, in part, a decade-long depression. And luckily, we didn't make those errors this time. This is a graph that shows the recovery in employment in Canada. That's the red line, back to where we were at before the pandemic, and then the U.S. Below it. The U.S. has not got back to where they were, and I've argued this previously in our lectures, that one of the reasons for our recovery was the stronger income supports that were paid out, that first of all stimulated more spending power, which was important, but also kept people connected to the labor market, connected to their former employers, not in desperate straits, so they were able to get back out and get to work when the economy opened up again. The inequality or sort of polarizing aspect of the COVID pandemic is a real concern, I think, and one that we have to take into account. Every recession is unfair. Every recession puts a disproportionate share of the cost on certain people who lost their jobs or certain industries that were affected. This one was brutally unfair for all kinds of reasons. First of all, unusually, this recession started in the service sector. Usually, if you were looking at what was the sector where the initial bad news happened that caused the ripple effect, usually it's construction, manufacturing, resources, okay? This one started in services because of the fact we had to shut down all of those face-to-face services. And by the way, those are industries where people in general have less well-paid jobs and more insecure jobs. So think about retail, think about hospitality, think about personal services. These are people who didn't have a lot to fall back on. They were in insecure, low-paid jobs to start with, and they're the ones who lost work. Most people who had a good paid salary position, a professional position, they didn't lose a cent in the pandemic. They were able to do their work from home, and lo and behold, the inequality, because so much of the damage was concentrated on the low end of the labor market, including among those in temporary jobs, part-time jobs, young people, made it all the worse. Same goes for gender inequality. Women had a greater hit in this pandemic than previous recessions because most of the workforce in those service sectors is women, and women were more likely to be in the temporary or part-time jobs that were eliminated first. So a definite widening of the gender gap because of this pandemic. Same goes for racialized workers and workers from different immigrant communities. Likewise, they're more likely to be sort of working in those industries that were shut down at first. Plus, they were more vulnerable to contagion because of pre-existing conditions and under-housing that was experienced in many immigrant communities. We saw the most concentrated outbreaks among communities who had low incomes and unfair access to jobs in the first place. Here in Vancouver, it was in Surrey, very high immigrant population there, and COVID infection rates 3 or 4 times higher than elsewhere in the city. Same goes for Toronto and other cities as well. So this disequalizing impact of the pandemic, I think, is a big, big problem. And it's another reason why we have to sustain, I would argue, we have to sustain the high level of government involvement in leading rebuilding and supporting people and communities that have been affected. I'd like to say a little bit about the so-called trade-off that we had some debates about in Canada, the so-called trade-off between protecting health by shutting down sectors and ordering social distancing and encouraging people to stay home versus so-called protecting the economy. And we had some leaders in Canada, a couple of premiers stand out. Premier Kenney in Alberta made this argument explicitly, and Premier Ford initially did in Ontario as well. And we had business leaders stand up saying, you can't shut down our industry. It'll damage the economy. Okay, even though the risk of contagion was very, very, very high. And then we had Similarly, business leaders and some politicians, again, like Jason Kenney in Alberta, he went to the Calgary Stampede and opened the Calgary Stampede and said, it's going to be the best summer ever, and we're not afraid. And we're going to rebuild the economy as a result. And that reckless act absolutely created and accelerated the next wave of COVID in Alberta, which was the worst, the one where they literally couldn't treat people in ICUs anymore. So that thinking that you're somehow helping the economy by relaxing the health restrictions and not shutting things down, and that there's a trade-off between health and the economy, was a huge danger in Canada and elsewhere around the world. Similar arguments were made by people with vested interests, either a political interest in somehow making themselves look brave and strong and willing to confront COVID by just going to work anyways, and by vested economic interests who, didn't care if the rest of the economy was shut down, but don't shut me down because I'm a small business and I need that money. And that argument of the trade-off is so damaging because, excuse me, it's so damaging because the reality is the biggest threat to the economy was COVID. It wasn't the shutdowns, it was COVID, because people were getting COVID, spreading COVID, getting sick, staying home, and then people wouldn't go out to restaurants because there's a risk you could catch COVID, and they wouldn't do the other things that were required. By far the best thing to protect the economy would be to stop the spread or limit the spread of COVID as much as you possibly could. And this is where, people lost the plot on what is the economy. We have stated from the beginning of this course, the economy is the sum total of the work that human beings do to produce the goods and services that are necessary to survive and thrive for a good quality of life. If we had that in mind, and if Jason Kenney and Doug Ford had that in mind, they never would have gone down this path of saying, well, we can't shut things down because it's too damaging for the economy. People are the economy. And if people are sick, the economy is going to be sick. And this should have been the guiding light. It was for most of our political leaders and some of our business leaders, but not enough. And we made some tragic mistakes. This is a graph that compares the decline in employment in each of the Canadian provinces over the first year of the pandemic, compared to the average number of cases per 100,000 that were raging during that time. And there is a clear negative correlation. Jason Kenney, despite his brave words about protecting the economy and a so-called balanced approach, oversaw the worst economic outcome from the pandemic of any province. And then it's by and large, the Atlantic provinces where they, for various reasons, were able to control COVID contagion and have much lower infection rates, which experienced the smallest impacts on employment and output. So there's no trade-off between the economy and people. And this is a lesson we should remember from COVID and apply it at every other debate or decision point that we face in the future. This was obviously a global problem. This shows the decline in GDP for all of the OECD countries, and then we've also included China in this list in the first year of the pandemic again. So this is 2020, and we had a decline in Canada of 5.4%. The red bar there, almost exactly equal to the average. So again, some countries did better, some countries did worse. By and large, the countries that did better were countries like Korea and Scandinavian countries that were able to control infection and keep the spread down. China is a place where GDP actually grew in 2020. This is ironic given that COVID started in China, but they had such a strong and consistent health response to stop the spread. They ended up with much less impact, both health and economic, of the COVID, of the pandemic, even though that's where it started. So number one, it's a global problem. Number two, there's no trade-off between the economy and COVID. Our best chance at protecting the economy is stopping COVID. I mentioned that we lost 15% of the employment in the first 2 months of the pandemic. We've rebuilt ourselves back to the same level of employment. We've now got employers all over the place saying we've got a labor shortage. And some people blame it on the pandemic and the CERB policies, the income supports that supposedly are encouraging Canadians to stay home instead of going to work. Well, we know they're not staying home instead of going to work. They're actually back to work to the same level as they were before the pandemic. The official unemployment rate, most recent, 6.7%. That is, in a way, just the tip of the iceberg. There's people who've lost most of their hours but are still working a bit. There's some people who weren't working at all but are still on the payroll at their workplace. And there's other Canadians who aren't working, want to work, but aren't actively seeking work. And for Statistics Canada to call you unemployed, you have to be actively seeking a job, putting in several applications a week. You can't just sit at home and watch the want ads. So there's a lot more surplus labor still in Canada's economy than is accepted, and then business leaders are complaining about this labor shortage. But in fact, realistically, I would say a more accurate level of the unemployment is more like 15% when you include these different hidden pools of underutilized labor in our economy. So we are not experiencing a labor shortage. We have employers who suddenly, especially in the hospitality sector and the retail sector, who relied on paying low wages, irregular hours, no benefits. That was their model. And the only reason they could attract workers was because they were so desperate they would accept the job. People aren't accepting those jobs anymore, in part because you have to stand across from a lunatic anti-masker who refuses to put on their mask. You have to pay me more than minimum wage to get me to do a job like that. So employers have to look at themselves in the mirror and think about what they can do to recruit and retain workers, and it's going to mean giving workers a better deal. I've got about 10 minutes left, and I'm just thinking I'm never going to get through what I had there, and so I am going to scoot through my presentation here, and I'm going to scoot to some bits at the end about how do we go forward, what comes next. Okay, so let me reshare the screen. Thank you for your patience on this. There we go. Okay, so you should have a slide again that says what comes next. We'll spend the last few minutes on that, and then we'll have a great discussion. I know we'll have lots of questions and comments on this. So we're not done yet, obviously. We have vaccines, and Canadians in general have been pretty good at taking the vaccines, and they've worked, thank goodness. And what a triumph of human ingenuity it was to be able to produce vaccines and get them out, not widespread enough, especially in poor countries which can't afford them. And COVID is just running rampant there. And that is a huge problem, obviously, in poor countries, but it's also a huge problem for us, because the more it runs rampant, the more it mutates. And we're seeing that with news of this new variant from South Africa. So failure to get the vaccines out to everyone who needs them, but triumph of innovation that we could develop these vaccines and use them so quickly. And for those of us in lucky places where most people took the vaccine, it has limited contagion. It hasn't eliminated contagion. So it turns out this disease is so contagious, we have to have something like 95% vaccine coverage in order to get herd immunity. More so than is the case for many other diseases. It's not unheard of. Measles is another one that's super contagious, and you need almost everyone vaccinated in order to deprive the disease of ground to grow on. And unfortunately, we've got enough of a small group who, for various reasons, largely some kind of ignorance and some kind of knee-jerk rebellion against authority. That seems to be part of it. People, economists, sociologists, and psychologists are trying to make sense of why do people buy into this anti-vaccine argument. And it's made worse, of course, because you've got opportunistic politicians who think, wow, I could get somewhere, tapping into that feeling. So you've got, obviously, people in Canada like Maxime Bernier and his party, but lots of conservatives federally and provincially think, yeah, this is a good kind of knee-jerk anti-government constituency. I'm gonna promote this and take advantage of it to try and build my base. Irresponsible and dangerous. So we've got to do more to get the vaccines out and stop the spread. The vaccines also, in addition to stopping the spread, when you do get it, you're obviously much less sick. So we've had less pressure, less deaths. On the other hand, we aren't there yet. So we've still got COVID raging. We've still got too many deaths and contagion, and we still have too many people not taking the vaccines. Even if everybody took the vaccine and we stopped the pandemic, that in and of itself wouldn't fix the economy. And this is why it's so important that we go through that bit about why is the economy unstable to start with, and what are those chain reactions that end up with a multiplied impact on the overall economy. So we've got employers who do not see their business returning, even if the pandemic ends. We've got consumers who are still worried about what comes next, and we got other problems like these floods and the damage to infrastructure and so on. So in my judgment, it's not enough to just sit there and wait for the economy to fix itself. In my judgment, we still need a very strong countercyclical response, not just in the sense of a sort of short-term, let's get back to work, but in the sense of a long-term rebuilding or reconstruction. And I've been making the argument, and one of the readings that we've put, the special readings that we put on the website for this week, is that we need a reconstruction plan after this pandemic. If we rely on businesses and consumers just to say, whew, that was bad, but it's over. Now I'm in a good mood. Let's go out and spend. Okay, yes, we will get a little kind of sugar high on the consumer front. There's no doubt about it, because people will be glad to go out to restaurants again. They'll be glad to travel again. They'll be glad to go shopping. And by the way, they've got some money in the bank because, as I mentioned, the COVID income supports actually increased total income among Canadian households. But that is not going to be enough to actually rebuild fully and get back to where we need to. We've got a private sector that I would argue is too damaged to undertake a full and autonomous recovery. We're going to have continued, strong, sustained government leadership to rebuild a situation where the economy is self-sustaining and good macroeconomic momentum with good job creation, as well as addressing the things we need to do in the wake of the pandemic. So there's a historical analogy for this, frankly. If we look back to World War II, when the country came together to fight an external enemy, not a virus. Well, I guess you could say it was a political virus. It was called fascism. And we mobilized all the resources that we could in Canada to help fight that war. We went from depression to true full employment almost overnight. By the end of 1939, Canada was just about to full employment because we put everyone to work in the war effort, including women who were already working at home, of course, but we brought them into formal paid employment to support the war effort. And nobody cared about the deficit. Nobody said we can't fight Nazis because it would be bad for the deficit, right? Everybody knew this had to happen, and it did happen, and we did a magnificent job. And we put the economy back to work. If you weren't a soldier, this is the amazing thing. If you weren't a soldier, on average, living standards improved in Canada during the war. Nutrition improved, health and life expectancy improved for people at home. Obviously, not for the soldiers. But it's a testament to how government spending can actually, even if it seems it's for a bad reason, like a war or repairing from a natural disaster, government spending can usher in prosperity when the economy is stuck, as it was in the 1930s. 2 years before the war ended, the government appointed this guy, C.D. Howe. He was the so-called Minister of Everything. He'd overseen the planning that went into the war effort. By 1944, they were already looking, okay, what comes next after the war? And they said, well, we cannot go back to normal. Okay, we can't go back to normal because normal had been a 10-year depression. Okay, plus, what were we going to do with all the soldiers coming home? So they developed a plan for a national post-war reconstruction and put C.D. Howe in charge of it. And it was a whole series of things that they did, including building modern peacetime industries like aerospace. This is C.D. Howe at an aerospace factory, but we ended up becoming a major civilian aerospace producer, in part because of the efforts that were taken after the war, and other modern industries like the auto industry and telecommunications equipment and others. We also built huge public infrastructure, Trans-Canada Highway, the St. Lawrence Seaway, all other kinds of public infrastructure. We expanded public education. We introduced and expanded public health care, broader public and caring services. all part of stimulating this post-war boom. So we didn't go back to a depression, in part because of a recognition of the need to continue ambitious public sector-led reconstruction. We actually entered a period of unprecedented expansion. And it was inclusive expansion because average people's living standards grew and grew rapidly during this period. So I think there's all kinds of things that we could target with a post-COVID reconstruction plan. And these would include things like investment in physical infrastructure, social and human infrastructure. The housing crisis, of course, in Canada is a huge problem. And the best way to address it is massive investments in what we would call non-market housing, community housing trusts or social housing or housing co-ops, other ways to take housing out of this speculative cycle that it's locked into right now. Long-term care, this was a blot on Canada's reputation. The fact that our long-term care facilities, especially the ones that are for-profit, run by private businesses, abysmal quality, huge risks, and then just let thousands of our seniors die in those hellholes. Horrible. And are we just going to say, okay, COVID's over and now we're going to have better, masking and distancing protocols? I hope not. I hope we say, look, long-term care is a vital, productive service. It adds to GDP. It's a source of work, and it enriches the lives when it's done right of our seniors in the last years of their life. So that could be a huge source of investment and growth and job creation. Childcare, of course, the federal government has now moved ahead with its national child care program. We've done some research on that at our center. It's going to create 200,000 jobs fully rolled out in the child care sector and lots more in the supply chain. And the biggest gain is it will allow more full labor force participation by women, which will help to address the so-called labor shortage that we have. The energy transition, of course, that's happening. We've talked about that in our previous class on energy and the environment and the economy, a huge potential source of investment and jobs. So in all of these different areas, where we can, as part of a coordinated reconstruction plan, put the pedal to the metal and have a positive stimulus instead of that negative shock that sparked the chain reaction and ended in a recession, a positive stimulus that gets more investment going, more jobs, more people earning income and spending it, and then a whole self-sustaining macroeconomic expansion from it, we could absolutely have another post-war era, another post-war expansion that's sustained for decades, frankly, to do all of these things. But it's going to require, first of all, a recognition that the economy isn't going to fix itself, and it's going to require putting priority on these human goals rather than on other things like reducing the deficit as the top priority. That wasn't the top priority even when we finished World War II with a much bigger debt than we have now. We didn't say, let's cut everything back and pay off the debt. We said, let's put people to work. And that's what took care of the debt. And that could do it now as well.